Welcome to Artist Talk, where we are reconnecting with transcendent heroes at borders to update what these incredible activists are doing during this COVID pandemic. In this episode of Artist Talk with Transcendent Heroes, Satsuki and I will discuss her work with helping children and families in the immigration detention centers, mental wellness during COVID, and an organization that she co-founded called Sudo for Solidarity. Sudo for Solidarity is an independent project working to end detention sites and support the impacted immigrant and refugee communities. Earlier this year, Sudo for Solidarity had plans to lead a national pilgrim march to Washington, D.C., demanding the closure of all detention centers. They were preparing to bring with them 125,000 folded paper cranes. Unfortunately, the pilgrimage was postponed. In this conversation, we will talk about how the organization is working to engage communities through virtual conversations and protests, and exploring what it means to be in solidarity when dealing with racism and state violence. Keep listening to hear more about her outstanding and much-needed activism. Good afternoon, Satsuki. So nice to see you.
Thank you, Taiji. Thank you for this opportunity.
Oh my gosh. Just the opposite. Thank you for joining us. And I want to sincerely thank you for participating in the show Transcendients, Heroes at Borders in a major way. You were the one that we actually wanted to highlight. And it started basically with a poem that you wrote that we all thought was so powerful. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind if you could recite the first few lines of that poem.
So it's called We Came Back for You. We came back for you because we know mass incarceration. We came back for you because we know family separation. We came back for you because we know deportation, because we know barbed wire, because we know indefinite detention. We came back for you because we care.
Oh wow, so powerful, really, really. And I can't help to feel that it speaks to your activism and sums up today what you're concerned about and what you're trying to achieve. I'm wondering what those words mean to you, if you might comment on that.
Well, I think, I don't consider myself a poet, but after showing up at the detention sites, knowing that there were hundreds of children who were being incarcerated just as I was, and my friends who were also children of the camps, it was like I had so many mixed emotions of anger and sorrow and just grief for my parents, that the only way I could really express it was to just sit down and write those words. I think the inspiration for me has been my mother and others have often spoken about how different it might have been for us if there had been people who marched for us, who signed petitions, who protested, who laid down their bodies to stop the trains from hauling us all away from our homes and jobs and schools. So when we had our pilgrimage to Crystal City, it just seemed like we couldn't ignore what was happening 40 miles west of where we had been incarcerated. So, and I had visited inside of those facilities to evaluate the trauma that the children were experiencing. And I saw myself in these children. So it just seems like that's part of a voice for Japanese Americans to speak out against what's happening to innocent people seeking asylum in this country today.
That is so thoughtful and heartfelt. And so it was a relatively recent poem that you wrote, I understand. And perhaps it was very cathartic to be able to write that poem and then realize those emotions and feelings that you were going through. Well, we are all blessed that you wrote that and given the world that poem to us. I would like to talk to you about the COVID pandemic and the developments that have evolved. First of all, if you could explain to everyone Tsuru for Solidarity and the march that was planned and how you have re-envisioned it because of the pandemic?
Actually, we started as a group of people who, many of us were either descendants or directly experienced the camp, and out of our idea of a pilgrimage, and also at our pilgrimage in Tule Lake that took place, there's more conversation about protest and the unique voice of Japanese Americans relative to the injustice that was being perpetrated today. So when we had our pilgrimage in Crystal City, we went to Dilley, Texas, which is not far from where Crystal City was. And actually, what happened was earlier, actually in 2015, I had been asked by Carl Takei, who's a fourth generation descendant of a Tule Lake prisoner, and he was with the National Prisons Project for ACLU and knew of the conditions inside this particular facility called Carnes. It's also in South Texas. And he asked me if I would come in as a visitor, because they don't let professionals in, to get some insights, some picture or essence of the trauma that the children were being exposed to as a psychotherapist. And so I slipped in with a group of religious visitors and had the opportunity to meet with mothers and children, and saw the so disturbing, horrific trauma that these children were experiencing and exhibiting symptoms that were very distressing, very frightened, anxious, mothers tearful, distraught, no idea how long they were going to be held, why they were being held, and what was going to become of them. And I think of my own mother having those very same thoughts. So from that point on, I was very aware of what had been going on. I returned several times, participated in marches there. But it was only after Crystal City that I really started talking to other Japanese Americans, and I wasn't the only one that identified with what was happening today. And so we felt that it was important to show up at these sites to protest, share our story, use our moral authority to protest. And I think one of the traumatic effects of our whole community having been incarcerated back then was to be fearful of challenging the government in any way. I know my parents always had the fear that if we stepped outside of the law, if we did anything, even as serious as getting a B in a class, that we had to be beyond suspicion. So it happened that the timing was right and people were open to that idea. And so we organized Sudo for Solidarity because when we decided to protest after our Crystal City pilgrimage, we decided to bring Tsuru, origami paper cranes, as a way of involving our community. Kind of the simple act of folding a crane might encourage people to participate in ways that they hadn't in the past. And we had this really amazing response. The word got out that we were collecting tsuru to hang at the fence of the South Texas Residential Center where we were going to protest. And we thought, well, hopefully we'll get 1,000 cranes, and the children who are in the prison would be able to look out and see on the fence these brightly colored birds with wings. And we hoped for 1,000, maybe someone, Mike Ishii, co-organizer, said we should hope to get 10,000, and we ended up getting 30,000.
Wow, really? Wow.
Yeah, it was. And somehow it struck a chord in our community about maybe the momentum building, about how outrageous this was, that this was being replicated again. Some people couldn't see the parallel or the relevance, but once we organized, and the perfect name for us was Sudo for Solidarity, because we wanted to be in solidarity with people who are being targeted today. And we wanted to use our Japanese cultural tradition to represent who we were and what our story was. So that's how we started. And that was actually, it hasn't been very long. We started in March. Mm. And today we have Tsuru for Solidarity hubs across the country because people in different regions of the country, thanks to Zoom, have dialed into our website and learned what we're doing. We have many young people who are very concerned about circumstances here in this country and the changes that need to be made. So yeah, it was just amazing how quickly people contacted us, wanted to participate. And so after a few of these very dramatic moments of showing up as a community in Oklahoma and repeatedly in Texas, we thought, people really want to participate. So we felt like we needed to get the message to the administration. We wanted to go to Washington, D.C. And so we decided to put a call out for 125,000 Sudo, which represents each one of us that was incarcerated during World War II. And we wanted to hang those on the fence near the White House and we had hoped for the largest gathering of Japanese Americans since we were incarcerated. And so we began doing a lot of outreach, fundraising, and it was so amazing to us, Taiji, how many Japanese American survivors of the camp, we're all now in our 70s, 80s, and 90s, wanted to come to Washington, D.C. Family members who are saying, we're bringing grandma, we're bringing my auntie, my mother and I are coming. I mean, all of these ways that people were going to make this a family pilgrimage, a place where they're going to use their voice and their story. And we wanted to have, we anticipated several thousand people coming and that all the survivors would be in the front and they would wear the tsuru draped over their shoulders and move in rows to the front where they would then hang the tsuru while 100 taiko drummers were drumming alongside of the march, and all of that was in place. We had the outreach to the taiko community across the country. The tsurus were coming in like crazy, and we found sites where we could store them. We had a committee across the country for people who would string the tsuru. We were ready, and then COVID hit. And the reality was, so many of us would be elderly. And at higher risk, and we just didn't feel like we could risk anything like that spreading through our community because of Sudo for Solidarity. So,
thank you for being so thoughtful. My gosh, that whole story, just incredible. And I was aware of it a little, but I didn't know the details, and I'm so impressed. So are you planning to do it? I'm sure in the future.
Even more inspired, because since then, of course, we have had killings of members of the Black community. We've had, increased numbers of children being held and separated, and brutal treatment of children in Black sites where there are no records being kept, and unaccompanied minors are coming across the border and then placed in these hotels that nobody knows who they are, where they are, and then being put on planes and buses and just sent back and dropped off from countries that they're escaping from. So things have worsened. So so we wanted to put out a call for, we had reached our 125,000 quickly.
That's incredible.
And people still wanted to fold.
Okay.
These are coming from Alaska, many from Japan, Canada, and our Sudo committee said, let's ask for 400,000 more. That will represent how many people who are being held in asylum. And we've asked for local hubs to collect Sudo with messages on it in honor of the members of the Black community who have been targeted by local area police. So we have canceled the Washington, D.C. event just so people could have their refunds and everything would be cleared that way. But definitely our intention is when it's safe. We don't think this problem is going to go away immediately. So we definitely have plans to go back.
Wow. That's incredible. Yeah, my grandparents and parents were incarcerated, and oh my God, it's so wonderful that you are speaking up and the whole nation is learning to protest, right? And this whole activism is just so needed, and I'm glad that we're living up to that. And congratulations on those plans. They are just so incredible.
But Taiji, the most moving thing from our community is people, I mean, this was my image, is that elders wanted to be there. So I pictured us with our hearing aids and our walkers and our wheelchairs and our canes and our teenage grandchildren helping us, that we're going to lead that march. We're going to make a statement, and we're going to be heard, and certainly follow up with legislators. We had already planned legislative meetings, bringing Sudo to congressional folks, and sharing our stories to make sure that we move towards having policy change as well. Yeah.
Is there anything that you could ask from all of us how to better prepare for this march and demonstration? Or do you need anything? What can we do?
Oh, well, we are not wasting our time. Tsuru is, we've shifted to, of course, online educational programs. And with the current uprisings that have been going on, and wanting to keep it safe, particularly for the survivors who are all elders for the most part, we're doing these educational programs called Community Conversations. And in June, we had one called Exploring Intergenerational Trauma. So this was an inward facing for our Japanese American community to talk about the intergenerational transmission of the incarceration trauma, because many Yonsei have asked the question, I think I've been impacted, but I don't understand how or why. And so they wanted that exploration. So in that June, so we did this major Zoom event, had Dr. Donna Nagata, who's been one of the early researchers on the impact of the incarceration on Japanese Americans, join me and Brian Nia for conversation about that. And then we have developed something that we were doing at our actions called Healing Circles for Change, where after a protest, and because we are working in solidarity, our protests always included the indigenous social justice community, the Black community, the Latinx organizers. And in the beginning, we'd show up for a protest and then we'd shout and part. People would go their separate ways. But what we found was so powerful was to ask people to stay afterwards, sit in a circle, and simply share our stories across community.
Oh, wow.
So for many of us, it was the first time we heard Native Americans talking about their incarceration, their removal, their family separation. Hearing from members of Black Lives Matter talk about how, this one thing really moved me was this African-American woman said, you guys are lucky because you even know what generation you are. You're saying first generation, second generation. I have no idea what generation I am.
Oh my God.
So much of their history is lost. And in these conversations, we were strengthening the solidarity, not just to show up, but to create this sense of unity that really, if we are going to make social change, we can't just wait for the white community to decide that Black people are okay and that everybody other than white people should have equity. But as people of color, if we strengthen our voices and share what we have in common, and in that way we're reversing the manipulation of the oppressors that have fractionalized us, that have split us, divided us. And certainly, we recognize the ways in which the Japanese American community were urged to fit this model minority myth. So after these actions, we found that rather than shouting and partying, when we sat together and shared our stories, we connected in deeper ways, in ways that most of us had never experienced before. You know, hearing really personal family stories, not just within the Japanese American experience, but across communities with tribal folks and organizers from Black Lives Matter and Latinx communities who had family members who were incarcerated in the moment. And there was a connection like I had never experienced. And so we decided that we would have healing circles for change at every action. And I just need to tell you this one part too, is that at one of our protests in Texas, there was a NHK crew wanted to come and film, and they said they'd like to go to the border. Would I take them to the border? So I said, sure. And I didn't realize what was going to happen, but I contacted this organization that I had been in touch with, the Laredo Alliance for Immigration. And so we drove to the border with a group of us. Several of the survivors wanted to go too. So we took several cars and we drove to the border. So we do these healing circles, and even online now, after we do these educational programs, we are doing healing circles. It's been pretty remarkable. So I developed this particular approach because at Laredo, we just happened to meet these mothers with their children who had just been released. There were these young DACA students from the Laredo area that were volunteering their time to help these mothers and children. And then there were us elders from Sudo for Solidarity. And so we decided we would sit and just share why we were doing what we were doing, everybody. And then it got to the Japanese Americans. It was very emotional. And there was a woman that was doing the simultaneous translation for us. And my brother, who's a very quiet, shy guy, I think woman that was doing the simultaneous translation for us was having a hard time keeping herself together too, because there were so many sad stories. And when my brother, who's older than I am, who was born in Topaz concentration camp, he stood up and he said, our families struggled, our families lost everything, and our families lost hope and that protested our incarceration. And we want you to know that we are going to be protesting for you. We want you to know that we made it, and we want to be a beacon of hope for you as well. And at that point, we were all crying. Oh. The translator could hardly function because she was so tearful. But that's when we realized how, because then the woman stood up, and this was the thing that just got me and why I had to write those poems, was the mother stood up with her baby in one arm and her toddler on her lap. And she told us the story of her escape. And then she said, I was held in the prison camp for 9 months, but when I hear that your family were held for 3 and 4 years, I can barely tolerate the pain that I feel for you. And I'm so sorry for your family. Compassion she had for us was so new, so authentic. And it was there that their struggle was our struggle. We were going to show up. And so even now on Zoom, I've managed to train 72 facilitators from across the country. So after we do a Zoom educational program, we break out into small groups, and a facilitator that's trained, we use this particular model, which is not complicated, but it gives everybody a chance to share their story in an environment of complete safety and empathy. And people, and we surveyed people afterwards to ask them, you know, how they felt participating in these healing circles. And it's been without exception so meaningful for people. And in the immigrant rights, social justice communities, the healing part hasn't really been addressed. People are angry, they're protesting, they're trying to gather their numbers, get money so that they could get people out there. So now Tsuru's been asked by these organizations if we would come and help them organize healing circles for change. We realized that the movement for Black lives right now has the potential to make huge change, and we need to be in solidarity with them. Our voices need to support their effort. We need to center the Black movement and be there to support them. We also understand that in the Japanese American community, we have been divided against the Black community. And so we need to look at our own anti-Blackness. So our next workshop is going to be an exploration of the Japanese American community's anti-Blackness. You know, like in my family, my parents were really good people and they survived the prison camp experience. But the term kurombo was something my parents used frequently, and it was used in our community. And it just was a reminder of how deeply embedded the idea that our survival depended on us to move away from poverty and the Black community and be more white.
Korombo is the term that you said?
Kurombo, yeah. So it's a denigrating term. So so when you put bo at the end of a word, you know, it's kind of childlike, and kuro is Black.
Right.
So kurombo was a denigrating term.
Wow.
But it was a very common term. And but it symbolized how you know, in order for us to survive, and this was really promoted by the prison administration, when you leave, you know, you need to not congregate, don't speak Japanese, you need to fit into, and people got their names changed from Satsuki, the teachers called me Sandy until I was an adult. You know, my brother Kiyoshi was called Kenny until he was an adult. And all these ways that the more white we were, the more acceptable we would be. And then, you know, the story of African Americans placed into permanent lower class, lowest rung on the ladders. It pulled us apart. And so Sudo for Solidarity is really wanting to explore that, examine that. So in October, we're going to do another community conversation online nationally. And we're going to have survivors who grew up after camp talk about their experience living with the Black community, because that's where most of us return to. In Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco, and LA, to strengthen the JA voice in support of the Black Lives Movement.
That is just really incredible. Do I understand? I'm just kind of speechless because it was just so powerful. And that when you say solidarity, wow, that's really the key word here. And you talk about healing. My goodness, there needs to be a lot of healing. And it's so significant that you are a therapist, and it's just incredible that you are able to use your profession to come up with how we do have to discuss things. And you almost make me feel like, you know, I'm a third generation, and what inner things are inside of myself too.
Well, and I think you're manifesting that in your artwork. Your outrage, your protest through your art, that doesn't come out of living a completely privileged life of no connection to trauma. You know, I mean, I see your work and I feel like you get me, and you're using your art as a way of pointing to the issues. Yeah. You're doing the work. Yes,
thank you so
absolutely.
much. That means so much coming from you. But also, I'm wondering if we could talk a bit about COVID as it ravages our nation. I'm just curious how you would react to the question, who are the most vulnerable in this situation? And the way it's during pandemics, sometimes it's just unfair how it attacks different populations.
Social psychology perspective, it's like there is a natural human tendency to look for a scapegoat. Can't blame anything specific, so they'll look for who to blame. So I think one of the many vulnerable targets, of course, elderly, people with underlying conditions, poor people, immigrants, people who don't have firm status and resources are going to suffer more. But for the Asian American community, we became the scapegoat. And this is exactly what happened in World War II. The need to identify some group to blame. It's often a targeted community that's vulnerable. And so the hate towards Japanese and Japanese Americans, and Japanese immigrants who'd lived here for years and generations contributed to the country, their neighbors that they've known for decades turned against them in many cases. Right. So with our president using terms like the Wuhan flu and the Chinese flu, it fed this need for people in our country in particular to vent their anger and their fear towards us. And as a result, not only are we dealing with the pandemic and other natural disasters, we're dealing with the human response to a threat. And there have been, several thousand Asian Americans who've been victims of this hate. And because of the lack of leadership back in World War II and now, guiding us to be our higher selves and to reach out and help each other, I think the scapegoats are likely to be the poor, the people of color, the vulnerable ones who don't have a voice to protest. So, it's been in many ways very disturbing for the Japanese American community that I'm connected with, because people are sharing stories of being spit on and yelled at and via social media being targets, and then it creates this fear beyond being contaminated by the virus, but also stepping outside, who might attack you, is this added level of anxiety, I think, that is in our community.
It's just shocking. And do you feel that as Asian Americans, we are speaking out enough? And is it being heard that this is not correct? Or
yeah, I think, I don't know about enough, but certainly groups have organized, Asian Americans Advancing Justice and Asian Law Caucus and OCA, various organizations have spoken out, made statements, confronted the Trump administration for statements made, and gathering data, gathering evidence, and encouraging people to sign up, go to the website to register any incidences so that we have proof. It's very disturbing that whenever the president uses that term, there is an uptick in anti-Asian incidents of violence. So, it's so irresponsible and in many ways so racist and cruel that, so now on top of everything else, it's like we don't have a leadership to trust that we'll be protected, that our, the best interest of the leadership is for us. And that's what happened during World War II. The shock that our own country is going to incarcerate us.
Right.
So I think it triggers past trauma, feelings of vulnerability and uncertainty.
But what can be different this time around is that this generation does speak out and voice their feelings and emotions. And we got to make a change, and we got to change the behavior and the reaction to the pattern. Oh, Satsuki, thanks you for all you do.
Well, and I feel so hopeful in working with the young generation, the Generation X, the millennials, who are less tainted by our trauma, and less, they're so, in some cases, so audacious. I love them because they're not afraid the way that we were as sanseis to upset the cart or offend or... and they're informed and they're energetic. And so Sudo for Solidarity has been very conscious of making sure that we have young people in our leadership and participating and facilitating. And it's so hopeful what's possible in the future now.
Yes, that's right. And then one of the goals, I think, is to rid of the detention centers. Is that correct? Of all detention centers?
Mission for Tsuru for Solidarity is to shut down these detention facilities. They are unnecessary and inhumane. And the money that goes out of your tax dollar to build these multiplying private prison corporations is for profit and inhumane. And there have been wonderful papers written, research studies done that shows that people seeking asylum can find safe harbor in the community, in community organizations, community systems that could be set up, that many of these people seeking asylum have family members in the United States that could take them in. So to use prison as the Band-Aid solution is, I think, a solution really embedded in using incarceration of people of color. We want them to shut down. We want asylum to be treated as a legal and humane process.
Okay, great, good. Yeah, let's do it. This is much more general, but about COVID, in regards to children, you talk about that feeling of being isolated and locked up. I'm sure you're much more aware than I am, but the stories of children, that they're afraid to go out now and they feel like this is the new norm that it's going to be, that I'm going to stay in a room and not socialize with others because it's safer to do. So I think there's so many things that come up during a pandemic and what happens and what kinds of traumas that people are having. But I feel like it's also a chance for people to empathize, to think about what happened, right, to the Japanese Americans during the war. And that general kind of feeling that people are experiencing right now, that's just a little hint of what was experienced. Do you think that there is some correlation?
Certainly. People are upset about sheltering in place, and we may have to do it maybe for a year. My family was confined for 4.5 years. They were confined in place and experienced outside the range of normal human experience. So outside the range of normal human experience, we don't have resources or systems in place that protect us. And the one thing that I'm really struck by, you know, when you put your mask on and you have to go outside to go to the grocery store or something, I see these children who don't see strangers smiling at them, who don't see the whole human face. And the studies of infants responding to the human face, now they're in their strollers and they're seeing people walking by with half of their faces covered up. You know, I wonder how that will change, you know, the developing brain in terms of feelings of safety and comfort. There are no smiles. I noticed that. So before, you know, when I walked down the street and there were strangers, I might nod my head or something like that. But I'm making a practice of actually saying, hello, hi, how are you? Because otherwise people are looking away from each other and there's this kind of disconnect that's happening on a regular basis. So in all these ways that we're cut off from each other makes it even worse. You know, I've done a couple of community talks about surviving COVID, coping with COVID, the Japanese way. And I bring up the camp experience and I say, you know, we heard from our grandparents and our parents very common Japanese words that helped them survive, to gaman and shikata ga nai, and we saw behaviors that they created art, they wrote poetry, they did things, they survived, and that we have that in our DNA to survive trauma. That we have a historical legacy that says, that we don't give up and waste our time. That we have in us legacy of having survived trauma today, and and that's not to say that there aren't people who are dealing with depression. The rate of depression has really in this country, and in my group that I do with Japanese American elders once a month, they were doing better. We talked about these 3 stages of surviving, coping, and thriving. First, you're on survival mode, where you're just doing everything you're supposed to do and responding. And then the second is so much time has passed and there's kind of a malaise and depression. And then hopefully there's a wake-up call, and people then decide that they've got to do this productively, and they go into thriving mode. Well, after the fires here, and now people who used to be able to go out in their gardens by themselves or take walks by themselves are now really fearful of breathing the air outside. The depression went up in my group. And so we had to recalibrate and say, okay, that makes sense, but we know the air will clear. We had to just do this whole reorienting ourselves. And people who have children, and the whole school issue, all the uncertainty, and uncertainty is like, that's what anxiety is about, is when you don't know what's going to happen. The more we communicate, the more we do things like you're doing here, having programs that people can watch to be uplifted, to be inspired by, to be educated by. We have to do that every day. We really have to keep going. Yeah. Well, I appreciate what you're doing, Taiji. I feel like besides gathering folks to talk, that your art is so, it does 2 things for me, especially the weavings. It shows the potential for parts of us, but also the integration of the whole. And that's, I think that's what life is about. Things happen and it fractures us, it separates us. And then we find ways to come back together. And we don't look exactly the way we might have, but we're whole. And and so your work has been very moving and inspiring to me.
Oh, thank you so much. I'll take the compliment. That's not really the Japanese thing to do, right? We need people like you to speak out, and the leadership, and certainly providing that. And so we're going to stay tuned to you, and the purpose for this is to catch up. I see everyone needs to always catch up to what Satsuki Ina is up to. And what is she talking about? Yeah, truly I believe that. So appreciate your time, and let's keep in touch. And good luck with everything. I'll be in Washington, D.C. with the whole nation in tune, and we'll all work together and really make a change. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Taiji. Thank you very much.
That was an enlightening conversation. I want to thank Satsuki for taking the time to share about her work in the Japanese American communities. Recently, her outreach extends to various disenfranchised groups through her work of Sudo for Solidarity. As I listened to her, I thought to myself, Satsuki Ina really has a pulse on what reform action we must take. From her healing circles, which uncover and reconnect to the pain and unjust practices and histories that are suppressed in so many generations of Americans. You can learn more about Satsuki and Sudo for Solidarity on Instagram at Sudo for Solidarity and her website, sudoforsolidarity.org. Once again, Thank you, Satsuki Ina, and stay tuned next week for another Artist Talk episode.